The final project in writing assessment theory and practice asks you to come up with learning outcomes, a prompt, an assessment instrument, and an assessment philosophy statement for a college level writing course. You also then write a reflection about how those materials that you put together, how they speak to the writing assessment scholarship that we've read this term. This video is going to walk you through how to build some of the common writing assessment instruments that are used for college level writing courses. It's applicable to a lot of other disciplines. We're going to talk a lot about rubrics and different kinds of rubrics, and that is used in a number of different disciplines, and it's used in a lot of places where writing is asked for. So it's pretty interdisciplinary. Gather a rubric, put it in front of students, and call it a day. Sometimes, particularly if you're teaching at an institution that has a lot of first-generation college students, anything that looks official like a rubric, you put it in front of them, they'll just say, okay, I guess that this is the game that we have to play. I hope, though, that after going through this class, I hope that you're thinking about assessment is a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more nuanced, and that you're thinking about aligning your values as an educator with how you're going about assessing student writing. So earlier this semester, I talked about the developmental writing exit exam. That's an excellent example of how you can get things out of alignment. You can say we really value and encourage students to talk to people about their writing. We really encourage them to revise their writing, but the test of whether or not they are ready for first-year writing is a timed writing exam. Those values are completely out of alignment. So we want to make sure that you're thinking about your assessment instruments and how they align with your values, with what it is you're trying to accomplish in a classroom, but also like where your students are. A rubric or an analytic rubric should help students understand how they're doing in a class. They're not just about you grading and evaluating their work. It should also give them an indicator of where they need to improve. They definitely do help you kind of focus your time and your energy in what it is you're going to look for when you're evaluating or providing comments on student writing. But their primary consumers should be students, and it should be giving students feedback about how they're doing. You should distribute rubrics in advance. Students shouldn't be caught blindsided right before they turn something in and like, oh, by the way, this is how I'm going to evaluate it. They should know what those criteria are well in advance. When I teach first-year writing, I don't hand students a rubric and, passively they're just saying, okay. I kind of force the issue. I have them work in pairs. Sometimes I'll make assignments out of giving feedback on a rubric, and sometimes I'll even ask them for criteria or for different quality indicators, like what does excellent work in this criteria look like? And students can even help me revise a rubric. I've taken their feedback and changed a rubric based on their input. They need to have some ownership of it. Your expertise definitely matters as an educator, and that should never be discounted. But students need to, I think it's only ethical that students know what's in a rubric and have some kind of ownership of that learning and of that instrument that you're going to put together. As Shawnee State University's Director of Assessment and Accreditation, I give workshops all the time on assessment. Last year, I gave a workshop on different assessment instruments. And so what I did is for this class is that I took some of those slides and just focused on the ones that I think are most relevant to writing assessment. So let me change screens and let's get started. Before we get started, I just want to explain the difference between two kind of broader levels of assessment. And I think you've come across these terms. And if you haven't put it together, here's kind of a definition that I think will help. Formative assessment versus summative assessment. Formative assessment is feedback that we provide students to help them know that they're on the right track. There's still an opportunity for them to learn. It's maybe a practice exercise in the class, and you give them some feedback like, yeah, that's on the right track. That practice exercise is usually tied to something bigger that you want students to learn. You're giving them formative assessment to let them know that they're on the right path. You're kind of forming their knowledge and giving them feedback on that knowledge as it forms, if you will. Summative assessment is assessment that it's summary. Here's how you did in this big assignment. So it's something that comes at the end of something. Formative assessment in the middle, summative assessment at the end of something, whether it's a class, a module, a project that they're working on. Summative at the end, formative in the middle. So one assessment instrument that I'd like to introduce you to is a checklist, and it's not something that you will use probably for a summative assignment or a summative assessment, although you could have like things like there was an image integrated into the essay or something like that, and then you kind of tick that off. But it's just kind of like the students did it or they didn't do it. And it's often used for like safety protocols and things like that. When I worked at UPS, we had checklists for how we loaded hazardous materials in a package car. Checklists could be used for some writing courses and some writing assignments, but it just kind of gives students feedback about how they're doing. So checklist is a really simple kind of assessment instrument that you could put together. Again, often used for formative assessments. A rating scale rubric, it's kind of like a survey that you provide students. I use these in group work, and could be, whether you use this for your final project or not. It's something to think about if you're assigning group work in a class. You've probably been in a class or in a group project where somebody did not carry their end of the bargain, like they didn't do their work. I like to check in with students to kind of see how things are going, and this is a rating scale rubric that I use on collaborative assignments. So you have members of a group evaluate the other members of the group, and you ask them kind of on this rating scale rubric, are they almost always doing their fair share of the work, often, sometimes, or rarely. Great, easy way to kind of get feedback about how things are going. Used for formative assessment, probably wouldn't use it for summative assessments. I'm starting to get into some of the rubrics or scoring guides that you could use for summative assessments, things that I think you might want to take a look at for your final project. So a holistic assessment is one where there's not specific points for each and every criteria. It's just kind of like the score, like excellent work is over here, and then there's descriptors about what it looks like for ideas and analysis, what it looks like for development and support, what it looks like for organization and language use. And when I've used these, when I was a graduate student at California State University, San Marcos, we did these really long scoring sessions of portfolios at the end of a semester, and all the first year writing courses, all students had to produce a portfolio, and they were all scored by 2 independent scores. So we kind of like huddled together, shared food, and just spent 2 or 3 days scoring portfolios. And if that sounds pretty mind-numbing, it is. But we would use these kind of rubrics, and we would highlight like, okay, I think this portfolio, I would highlight this here, but I think that the second sentence really here kind of describes the argument. So it's more of a 5 here for parts of it. And you kind of just take a look and see where most of the highlighting is at, and you say, you know what, I think that this is a 5 or a 6, or you do what teachers do because this kind of scoring stuff is really tough, 5.5 or something like that. So a holistic scoring guide where you're describing what excellent work looks like for ideas and analysis, development and support, organization, language use, and then you're highlighting the text that pertains to the student essay that you're scoring. So holistic scoring guide. Most times when people think about assessment instruments, they're thinking about analytic rubrics. They're ones that I use pretty frequently. We've read some critiques of rubrics, and I think that those critiques are valid. I think rubrics do kind of oversimplify writing sometimes. I use them because I need some kind of guidance for when I'm scoring student work. So when I have to get down to the ugly work of evaluating students' writing, rubrics can be pretty helpful. They kind of keep me trained on what I say is the most important thing. So to develop an analytic rubric, these are the steps that I share with faculty when I'm doing an assessment workshop. So you align your course goals and objective with the assignment being assessed. We've talked a little bit about that with learning objectives, so you've already thought that through a little bit. You articulate clear learning goals for the assignment being assessed. You should have those. You convey the learning goals for the assignment into criteria you can find in student work. So organization, that could be one of the learning goals for an assignment. Then you need to ask yourself, what does that look like in student work? Well, it looks like they use transitions maybe, or maybe there's a clear reason why they're going from one paragraph to another. Maybe there's a particular kind of organization schema like chronology or cause and effect or something like that. So what does it look like when students have work that's organized? You convey those learning goals into criteria you can find in the student work. So organization might be one or two different criteria. It might be transitions and placement. You then create descriptions of each criteria at each performance level. So you take that organization criteria and then you describe what it looks like for A level work if you're going that route, or if you're doing a B contract or a grade contract, you say, in order to satisfactorily live up to your end of the contract, here's what organization looks like for that kind of essay. Then you test and revise the rubric. That's the I highly recommend that you test out your rubric with your students and revise it and tweak it so that they, again, they feel a little bit of ownership in that rubric. Something to keep in mind as you all are thinking about putting together an assessment instrument, if a rubric is the way that you're going to go, or an analytic rubric is the way that you're going to go, is to think about breaking down difficult learning goals. To assess student writing, it doesn't mean you need to dumb things down. It just means you kind of need to break things down a little bit as best you can. So if you just say that I'm going to evaluate based on critical thinking, that is a really broad and kind of subjective thing. And that doesn't mean that subjectivity can't be a part of assessment. It definitely is. But in order to help students and be transparent as possible with students, we kind of want to break that down as best we can. So we might identify or define critical thinking as questioning assumptions, synthesizing perspectives, being able to kind of say, here are a couple different ways that we can look at critical thinking, and using this as things that you're going to look for in that rubric. I'm a big proponent of using language that students understand. So you decide what are the performance levels for your rubric. So maybe, if you're going to do A, B, C, D, F, I guess you could do that. That's a lot. I try to keep it simpler. So maybe 3 criteria or performance levels, maybe 4 performance levels. I think it's important that we use language that students get. So if this works, if your students get it, that's cool. I use language like this sometimes for first year writing courses. Nailed it, got it, close but not there yet, didn't get it. I want students to know that they're on the right path when they get the feedback. So exceed standard, I guess most students will probably know what that means. But you want to make sure that you're writing to your audience. The students are the audience for your rubric. In the individual cells of a rubric, so you'll have, and I'll give you an example here in a little bit, but you'll have the different criteria on the left-hand side, and up here you might have the performance levels like nailed it here, got it, or however you go about it. The language that you use here to kind of describe, that needs to be written so that students know what they're looking for. They should be able to pick up a rubric, take a look at their work and say, yeah, you know what, I think I did it, or, there's some areas that I need to address. It shouldn't just be for educators. The rubric should be written for students. So write descriptions of student performance on each criteria. I recommend you start with passing or acceptable work. So if C's get degrees, what is the C level, what does a C level of organization look like? I recommend that you begin with that. What's the bare minimum for a student to pass? What does that look like for integrating sources? So kind of asking yourself, what is the passing level, and define that for yourself, and then think about how you would describe that to students. That's where I start when I'm writing a rubric, thinking about that passing level. As best you can, be descriptive use objective terms, avoid subjective terms like things that I like. The I keep that out of there. I try to keep it about like things that I can observe in student writing when I'm describing what performance level, like what exceeds looks like for organization. I try to keep that as objective as possible. So here's an example of an analytic rubric. So on the left-hand side are the criteria that I'm looking at. And this is for a film review assignment. It's something that I teach in English 1101, 1102. So first semester, first year composition course at Shawnee State. And I like film reviews because everybody likes a good movie. And we all watch Night of the Living Dead because it's free and they can watch it on YouTube. So even if they miss class, not a big deal. So I asked them to write a review, and the criteria, the first criteria for me, the most important thing is they're in a writing course is that they're actually able to revise. They're not just editing and proofreading, they're actually substantially writing and rewriting portions of their text. So I describe what A or B looks like, what C or D looks like, and then what F work looks like. So there's significant revision here, a little bit less here, and there's only editing or proofreading here. So I think this follows a lot of what I'm talking about when it comes to rubrics. The more I look at my rubrics, the more I wish I would have changed them. Like I think that this gets kind of subjective here, and it's not super helpful to students. And I think the next time I teach, I will work with my class on kind of figuring out better language to describe supporting an argument. Integrating quotes, I think I did a pretty decent job here. So essay integrates two quotes effectively. So quotes are set up, appropriate length, always discussed after the quote. So quote sandwich thing. And then I talk about what, there's one that's integrated effectively. And then for failing work, it's that neither were integrated effectively. So criteria on the left, describing what A or B work looks like, trying to be as objective as possible, things that you can actually see. And I started here with like, what is the bare minimum that I will accept? And then I went and defined A and B work and then F work after that. Two things to kind of wrap up the video here. One, grade contract rubrics. They're very similar to an analytic rubric. You could even use a holistic rubric. And you just kind of say, in order to meet the B contract, if you're using B contracts, here's the minimum for what it looks like for organization or for integrating quotes and so on and so forth for the different criteria. So you're just saying, here's what it means to meet the contract. Here's what it looks like when you don't meet the contract. There's also single point rubrics. And I think in the reading for today, I think that there's some discussion of that. But a single point rubric is where you say, I'm just going to describe what it looks like. I'm going to give you the criteria. I'm going to describe what it looks like when you meet that criteria. And then that's all you're going to give students. Like, here's what it means when you meet it. There's no language about exceptional work or failing work. It's just like, this is where I want you to be. And that's kind of an interesting approach. Here's where I want you to be. And I'm going to write about, in your feedback on that assignment, about whether or not you lived up to that. And if you exceeded it, I guess there'll be some description there. I've never used a single point rubric, but I do think it could be kind of a cool thing and useful thing to include in your class. So last thing that I'll leave you with is that when you are using rubrics, they're helpful to kind of, again, give feedback to student work. A few final notes to kind of wrap up the discussion of assessment instruments that you could put together for a writing assignment. One is that you can kind of modify an analytic rubric for grade contracts. So you can say, here's what it looks like when you meet the B contract. That's typically what I use in first year writing courses, a B contract. So here's what it looks like to meet a B contract for all the different criteria in this assignment. So, and some of those might be checklist items. It might be like it was turned in on time, it was in the right format, you wrote at least 2,000 words, and for organization, here's the quality level that it needs to be at. So it's kind of like, you did it or you didn't do it, and there's description of the different the quality of organization, quote integration, things like that that you might be including in the assignment. There might also be some description of what it looks like if they don't meet the B criteria in those different kind of things that you're looking for in the assignment. So you can also put together a grade contract rubric. There's also something called a single point rubric that I haven't used, and I think the reading today mentions it. It could be something you could look up too and take a look at how other folks have used it. But a single point rubric is where you only describe what passing level works like. And that kind of and I'm kind of intrigued by that, kind of doing research and putting this together. You define what it looks like, passing work for idea development or paragraphing or whatever it is that you're looking for in a particular assignment. Here's what passing level looks like. And then there's writing and discussion that you have afterwards saying, here's my discussion of whether you met that or not. So a single point rubric could also be an option. Last thing I want to mention before I take off for this video is after you've provided feedback to students, you've completed all the grading, you've scored all those essays, you've completed a rubric if you put that together, use that data. Those of you that have taught for a while, you've probably heard this ad nauseum, but folks that are newer to teaching, those completed rubrics, knowing that half your students didn't do so well in one particular criteria is great feedback for the next time you teach. If it's a criteria that students are going to need for their next class, or if they're going to need later on, like integrating quotes, if half your students didn't do all that great of a job, or if it was one of the lower performing criteria for an assignment, that is something to work on for the next assignment. So kind of take a look at how the class as a whole did. You do definitely want to give students feedback, but you also want to use that data to improve your teaching, but then also to kind of tells you what you might need to do with the class moving forward. Okay, that's a lot. I'm super excited to take a look at the assessment instruments that you guys put together for your projects, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.